My name is Claire Mitchell. I'm 35 years old, and for the past 10 years I've lived without a family. One quiet morning in my Carmel beach house, I thought it would be just another day. Coffee emails the ocean outside my window, but then I opened my laptop and saw a name I hadn't read in a decade. Linda Mitchell, my mother. After 10 years of silence. At first I thought it was a mistake, but the subject line stopped me cold family Thanksgiving invitation. And when I scrolled down and saw the address, my breath caught. They hadn't just rented a house in Carmel, they had rented my house. The same family who once told me I wasn't needed was about to walk through my front door. What happens when the people who cast you out suddenly become guests in your home? The soft chime of my alarm had pulled me from sleep earlier, and for a moment I lingered in the warmth of the blanket, listening to the waves outside my window. The Pacific had become my anchor, its rhythm steady when nothing else in my life had ever been. 15 years ago, I had left a small town in the Midwest, with nothing but stubbornness and a raw ache to prove myself. At 35, I had built a life far removed from those roots. Mitchell Realty Group had grown into a respected name in high-end real estate, each deal a stone laid. My own hands. My house in Carmel, perched above the ocean, stood as proof that I had survived, endured, and created something lasting. I padded barefoot into the kitchen, pressed the coffee machine, and leaned against the counter as the grinder hummed. The smell of beans filled the air, grounding me. When I settled at the dining table with my mug, the warmth in my palms felt like a small blessing. Emails filled the screen, contracts and Big Sur investors in Hawaii, project updates from my team. It was routine, predictable, a kind of control I had taught myself to depend on. Then I saw it. A name I hadn't read in a decade. Linda Mitchell, my mother. The sight froze me. My finger hovered above the trackpad, but I couldn't move. For 10 years there had been nothing. No calls, no cards, not even the hollow gesture of a birthday text. Silence that sharp had carved itself into me, harder than stone, shaping how I lived, how I trusted. And now suddenly an email. My hand tightened around the mug until it burned against my skin. I told myself to delete it, to erase her words the way I had erased their hold over me. My finger drifted to the key, but curiosity, old, hungry, dangerous, pulled me closer. Against my better judgment, I clicked. The subject line slammed into me. Family Thanksgiving invitation. My stomach turned. Thanksgiving, once a word of warmth and crowded tables, now only summoned the memory of exile. I scrolled quickly, heart-pounding eyes darting over the list of names. My father, my mother, cousins I hadn't spoken to in years. David, his wife, Emily, their children. Everyone but me. The familiar sting rose sharp as ever. I told myself it didn't matter that I had long stopped expecting my name among theirs. But the ache bloomed anyway, the way an old scar throbs when touched. I nearly shut the laptop, determined to bury the letter with the rest of the past. And then I saw it. Our family has rented a beautiful beach house in Carmel to celebrate Thanksgiving this year. I blinked, certain I had misread. My eyes traced the line again, slower this time. Carmel. My pulse quickened. I scrolled further down until I saw the address. 1470 Seaview Lane. The mug slipped from my hand and hit the table with a dull thud. Coffee splashed across contracts, staining the pages dark. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment the world tilted. Seaview Lane. That was my house. Not just a house, my sanctuary, my fortress. The place I had bought with years of sacrifice, late nights, and tears no one saw. A home built from everything I had endured. I read the line again, whispering it aloud as if the words might shift. But they didn't. They hadn't simply rented a beach house in Carmel. They had rented my house. Heat surged up my neck, my pulse hammering against my temples. A bitter laugh almost escaped me at the absurdity. The same people who had cut me out, who had made me feel like an intruder at my own family's table, had unknowingly chosen to celebrate Thanksgiving under my roof. Fate had a cruel sense of humor. I shoved the chair back and paced to the window. Outside, the Pacific stretched endlessly, waves breaking white against the rocks. The view had always soothed me, but now the sound felt sharper, louder, mocking, almost like the ocean itself was echoing my disbelief. And then David's face came to me. My brother, his smirk carved into memory. I heard his voice as clear as if he stood behind me. Thanksgiving does not need you. 10 years, and the words still cut. I saw the dismissive glance he gave me, the certainty in his tone that had ended something inside me. David, the golden child, untouchable in their eyes. And now he and the rest of them were preparing to step through my door, laugh in my living room, sit at my table, all without realizing who owned the walls around them. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, my reflection faint against the sea. Anger surged hot in my chest, only to be chased quickly by something heavier. Fear. What did this mean? Was this fate forcing confrontation, offering closure, or simply a reminder that no matter how high I had climbed, the past could always reach me? I closed my eyes, letting the sound of the waves rush in. But instead of calm, I heard a storm that had been waiting 10 years to break. When I turned back, the laptop still glowed on the table, the email alive with my mother's words. Just pixels, and yet they felt like a door cracking open into a room I had boarded shut long ago. My hands trembled as I realized there was no way around it. My family was coming, and they were coming to my house. The coffee had pooled across the table, bleeding into a contract, but I couldn't move to clean it. My chest was tight breath, shallow, the weight of inevitability pressing down. Somewhere deep inside, I knew this wasn't an accident. Life had circled back, dragging me into a confrontation I had never chosen. And ready or not, the storm was already on its way. The storm of memory pressed against me, as if it had been waiting all these years. And suddenly I was no longer in my sunlit home by the ocean, but back in that cramped dining room in Springfield a decade ago. I was 25. My hands trembling slightly as I held a glass of water, the rim slick against my fingers. My chest throbbed with anticipation, because that night I had news worth sharing, news that might finally draw their eyes toward me with something other than indifference. I had been promoted to project manager in San Francisco, a step that felt like a door swinging open to a future I had dreamed of since leaving home. The air smelled of roasted turkey and rosemary, heavy and comforting, yet suffocating in its familiarity. Candles flickered in the crystal holders that once belonged to my grandmother, their flames bending with each draft from the kitchen. Susan. My stepmother swept between rooms, apron tied neatly, her movements brisk and purposeful, as though this dinner were a stage play and she was its director. My father sat silent at the head of the table, his glasses low on his nose, his fork tapping once against his plate before stilling. Around him, cousins whispered and nudged each other, the clink of silverware and the shifting of napkins filling the waiting quiet. My heart pounded as I spoke, my voice threaded with careful pride. I told them about the promotion, how it was more than just a step forward, how it was proof that the long nights and endless hours had led somewhere. I held my breath after the words left me waiting for the smallest sign of recognition. A nod, a smile, anything. Instead, silence. It spread across the table like frost, settling into every face turned carefully away from mine. I searched each expression, desperate for a flicker of acknowledgement, but found only blankness. My chest tightened, the excitement in me collapsing into something brittle. It was David who finally broke the quiet. He leaned back in his chair, the wooden legs creaking against the floor, a smirk curling his mouth. His voice slid into the room, sharp as glass. That's just a fancy title for selling houses. Nothing worth talking about. The words hit me with the sting of an open hand. My fork slipped from my fingers and struck the plate with a sharp metallic clatter that made several heads jerk up. The cousins bent their gazes, lower knives, sawing at turkey they no longer tasted. Susan coughed lightly. Her smile stretched thin as she reached for the potatoes, muttering something about gravy. My father shifted in his chair, eyes fixed firmly on his plate, unwilling to lift his gaze toward me. No one spoke for me. Not one person. David leaned forward now, elbows on the table, his eyes locked onto mine with a casual cruelty that left no room for misunderstanding. "You're not needed here, Claire. Not tonight. Not at this table." The words came smooth, almost lazy, but they slammed into me with the force of a slammed door. My breath caught sharp in my chest. Heat rose to my cheeks, my eyes burning as tears blurred the feast before me. The turkey and stuffing warped into a haze, the scent of rosemary suddenly acrid. My chest ached with a pain I could not name, a blend of betrayal and humiliation, the kind that seeps deep into bone. I pushed back my chair. The wooden legs scraped against the hardwood with a screech that cut through the room. Every head turned, but no one spoke. Forks hovered mid-air, cousins frozen in uneasy stillness, Susan's hand tightening around her napkin. My father kept his eyes on his plate as if looking up would cost him something. I rose, the weight of their silence pressing down harder than any insult. My legs shook as I moved away from the table, each step loud against the floor. The sound of my heartbeat filled my ears, drowning out even the scraping of silverware. My hand gripped the doorknob, slick with sweat, and for a moment I almost turned, almost begged for someone to stop me. No one did. The November air hit me like ice as I stepped outside. My breath came in ragged bursts, visible in the cold night. Tears slipped hot down my cheeks, the contrast burning against the chill. Behind me, the muffled sounds of dinner, continued laughter already creeping back into the house as if my absence had erased me in an instant. I stumbled to my car, yanked the door shut, and let the engine roar to life. The vibration rattled through me, masking the tremor in my hands. I pulled onto the road, headlights cutting through the dark, the hum of tires loud against the silence inside me. I cried until my chest hurt, sobs rising and falling in rhythm with the wheels. I cannot even remember where I drove, only that I needed miles distance, anything to separate me from that table where I had been stripped of belonging. That night marked the end of something inside me. It was the last Thanksgiving I would ever spend with them. Every year after became a ritual of absence, a day marked not by gratitude, but by silence and shadows. I buried myself in work and deadlines and contracts, convincing myself I no longer needed their approval, that my worth could not be measured by their cold shoulders. But the truth is, their words never left me. They lingered in quiet moments, whispered in the back of my mind whenever doubt crept in. Even as my career flourished, even as I built a life with my own hands, the scar remained. It had healed, but beneath the surface it pulsed, waiting. And now, standing in my home with that email glowing on the screen, the scar throbbed again as though struck fresh. Linda Mitchell, my mother's name, the address beneath it, the reality of what it meant. My family was coming back into my life. Not by invitation, not by choice, but by accident, by the cruel twist of fate that had led them to rent my house. It was no longer just memory. It was here, real, alive, a storm gathering at my doorstep. And I knew deep down there would be no avoiding it this time. The memory of that Thanksgiving exile clung to me like a shadow, but the years that followed brought trials far harsher than silence at a family table. On the outside, I walked with poise through glass towers in San Francisco, my heels clicking against marble floors, a portfolio tucked under my arm. To strangers, I was confident, composed, already rising. Inside, though, I was still raw, still that young woman, desperate to prove herself, desperate to carve out a place where no one could dismiss me again. I remember the winter of 2013 as the first time life stripped me bare. San Francisco glowed with neon and ambition, every block buzzing with possibility. Yet behind the polished glass and the promises of opportunity lurked men like Michael Carter. Men who smelled the hunger in people like me. I met him at a networking mixer in the financial district. The room was warm with chatter and the faint aroma of wine, but it was his voice that cut through, low and smooth like a man who never needed to raise it to be heard. He wore a navy suit that seemed tailored to perfection, his hair slicked back neatly, his smile carved with just enough charm to soften suspicion. He shook my hand with a grip that lingered a moment too long, as if to say, "You can trust me." He spoke of possibilities I hadn't dared let myself imagine. A development project on the edge of the city. He set his eyes steady on mine as though every word were meant only for me. His sentences were polished, rehearsed even, but woven with just enough warmth to sound genuine. He painted pictures of returns so high they glittered like the skyline itself. Early investors, he explained, would reap rewards that could change their lives. I should have been cautious. I had worked too hard, saved too carefully. Every dollar had come from long nights alone in the office weekends, when friends were out laughing while I stayed behind crunching numbers. My savings weren't much, but they were mine, scraped together from sheer willpower. And yet, sitting there with his steady gaze on me, the glow of success reflected in his polished shoes, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. I told myself I wasn't naive, that I was sharp enough to see through lies. But when he leaned closer, lowering his voice, as if sharing a secret meant only for me, I let myself believe. "You remind me of myself when I was younger," he said, a small smile curving his lips. "Hungry, determined. This deal could be the one that launches you. Don't let hesitation keep you small." The words pierced something fragile inside me. I thought of David's smirk at the Thanksgiving table, of the way my father's silence had cut deeper than words. I wanted to prove them wrong. I wanted to prove myself right. And so I poured nearly everything I had into Michael Carter's hands. It didn't take long for the mask to fall. One morning I walked to his office ready to deliver signed paperwork, but the glass door was locked. The nameplate is gone. The blinds drawn. His phone rang only to a disconnected line. Emails bounced back with cold mechanical rejection. The truth crawled up my throat like bile. He was gone. My money, my trust, my fragile confidence. All of it evaporated overnight. The days after blurred together. I could not eat. Food turned to ash on my tongue. I could not sleep. Each time I closed my eyes, his voice returned smooth and steady, replaying every false promise. I walked the city streets, hollow my reflection in dark windows, looking more like a stranger than myself. Shame clung to me like a second skin, thick and suffocating. I had been a fool, and worse, I feared I had destroyed my future before it had even begun. It was in that lowest moment that I thought of Jasmine Torres. We had met at the firm, her reputation already blooming as a young attorney whose fire filled every room. Her eyes missed nothing sharp with intellect, yet softened by empathy rare among lawyers. I called her late one night, my voice cracking as I confessed everything. I braced for judgment, for ridicule, but none came. She listened, each silence steady, each word of mine met with quiet strength. And when I finished trembling and broken, she said only, "We will fight this." The weeks that followed tested me in ways I had never known. Jasmine pulled me into her office, papers spilling across her desk, her pen tapping in rhythm with her relentless mind. She explained affidavits, filings, depositions, words that tangled in my ears, until her certainty made them clear. We worked late into the night, fueled by coffee and stubbornness, mapping every piece of Carter's scheme, building a case that cut through his polished lies. I remember the first deposition, the way my hands shook as I held the pen, the way Jasmine leaned close, her presence steadying me when my voice faltered. She reminded me that I wasn't the foolish girl Carter had marked me as. I was the one standing up, daring to demand justice. The courtroom itself was another world, cold, echoing, unforgiving. I sat stiff in the plaintiff's chair, my heart pounding with each glance from strangers who judged me with their silence. Then Jasmine rose. Her voice filled the room, sharp, clean, slicing through the defense's posturing. She laid out the contracts, the timelines, the bank statements, one after another, until his polished mask began to crack. I watched sweat bead along his temple, his lawyer shifting in his seat, arguments unraveling thread by thread. And then the gavel fell. Judgment in my favor. Relief surged. But it was more than the restitution of money. It was vindication. Proof that I was not as naive as he had assumed, that my pain and effort had not been wasted. Proof that I could face betrayal and survive. Stepping out of the courthouse, the sun glaring against the stone steps, I felt something shift inside me. The noise of the city swelled, but for once it did not drown me. I lifted my chin, inhaled the sharp winter air, and let the weight slide from my shoulders. Jasmine walked beside me, her smile fierce and proud. "See, she told me you are stronger than you think." She was right. I had entered that fight as a frightened young woman scrambling to protect the scraps of her ambition. I walked away, tempered by fire, shaped into someone who knew she could endure the worst and still stand. From that day on, every contract I signed, every deal I entered, carried the imprint of that lesson. I scrutinized carefully, trusted, only after proof moved forward with the quiet confidence that I could demand justice if betrayed again. The bitterness remained like an old scar, but it no longer consumed me. It became fuel pushing me further. I often think back to that version of myself on the courthouse steps, my legs trembling but my resolve unshakable. She did not yet know the empire she would build, or the ghosts of family betrayal waiting to return. But she knew one thing clearly. No one would ever erase her worth again. The courthouse steps faded into memory, but what lingered was the fire it had lit inside me. That fire carried me through years of relentless work, deal after deal, each one laying another stone in the foundation of a life I could finally call my own. By 2022, I was no longer the young woman clawing her way through San Francisco's noise. I was 35, head of Mitchell Realty Group, and I had built a reputation people respected. I still remember the morning I first saw the listing, a coastal property on Seaview Avenue in Carmel, perched high on the bluff with walls of glass that opened straight into the Pacific. The price tag was staggering $4 million, a figure that once would have mocked me. But that day, when the photographs flickered across my laptop, something inside me surged. I traced my fingers across the screen, imagining what it would feel like to stand in that living room, the horizon stretching into endless blue. The day I drove down the winding coastal road, the house rose into view like something out of a dream. White stone glistened against the ocean's backdrop, wide terraces spilling out into the air, as if they floated above the waves. When the realtor pressed the keys into my hand, the weight of them nearly buckled my knees. They were not just keys. They were proof of survival. Inside the house smelled faintly of salt and fresh wood, the scent of something untouched and waiting. Sunlight poured in through walls of glass, spilling golden patterns across the hardwood floors. I ran my hand along the counters, cool and smooth, grounding myself in reality. Each surface seemed to whisper back, "You made it." I walked the house slowly, each room echoing with meaning. The kitchen was bright and wide, every surface gleaming. To anyone else, it was just a kitchen, but to me, it was warmth reclaimed. I remembered the Thanksgiving table where silence had choked me, where my voice had been drowned by contempt. Now here was a place where meals could be mine alone, where no one could tell me I did not belong. The living room, with its open windows and sweeping view of the ocean, felt like a declaration. This was the room where laughter would echo without cruelty, where silence would soothe instead of suffocate. The wide dining table stood in the corner waiting. I brushed my hand across its polished surface and thought of all the years I had been denied a place at the family table. This one belonged to me, and it would never reject me. Then came the balcony. The wind tangled my hair as I stepped out, the sea roaring below. I leaned against the railing, and for the first time in years, I felt something inside unclench. The horizon stretched forever, swallowing pain in its vastness. Out there, rejection seemed small, as fleeting as a footprint washed away by the tide. The balcony was not just a view. It was freedom. When it came time to sign, I held the pen as if it were a lifeline. The contract lay before me, pages crisp, my name already typed at the edges. My hand trembled, but not from doubt. This was no ordinary transaction. Each stroke of ink was a rebirth. As the pen glided across the paper, I felt the last tether to the girl who had been humiliated and cast aside snap free. The house was more than stone and glass. It was my resurrection. Nights in the house became rituals of healing. I threw the windows open and let the surf roll in its rhythm, constant soothing like a heartbeat I could finally trust. I lit candles on the dining table and ate dinners alone, the clink of silverware against porcelain, no longer a reminder of rejection, but a song of independence. On weekends, I wandered barefoot along the sand, collecting shells and driftwood, small pieces of the ocean's story that I could carry back inside. Sometimes I caught my reflection in the glass walls. The woman staring back was not the one who left a Thanksgiving table in tears, nor the one nearly ruined by a thief in a suit. She was stronger now, sharper, carved by fire and water into something enduring. The scars were still there, but they no longer marked weakness. They marked survival. Friends who visited said the house felt alive, like it had absorbed part of me. They told me it was strong, modern, open, yet private. I believed them. I had chosen each piece with care, furniture that spoke of comfort, art that told stories of persistence. Nothing here was decoration for its own sake. Every detail was a reflection. On quiet evenings, I sat on the deck with a glass of wine, watching the sky blaze with sunset. The air cooled as the stars appeared one by one. In those moments, I thought of all the nights I once cried into my pillow, wondering if I would ever be whole again. Now the silence no longer terrified me. It wrapped around me like a blanket, steady and eternal, as if the waves themselves promised I was safe. This house was not just a shelter. It was a sanctuary. It was the proof that no matter what had been taken from me, love, belonging, the illusion of family, I had built something enduring and beautiful. As the last light of the day spilled across the horizon, I stood on the balcony once more, the salt wind brushing against my face. I closed my eyes and felt it. This was not just a house I had bought. This was who I had become. The house on Seaview Avenue had given me peace, but even the calmest waves could not wash away every scar. My walls of glass and stone stood strong against the Pacific, yet in the quiet of night, echoes of rejection still slipped through the cracks. There was only one person in my life who I trusted enough to let see those shadows, Jasmine Torres. That afternoon, she arrived in Carmel, her dark hair pulled back in its usual neat bun, her suit jacket draped casually over her arm. Years in the courtroom had sharpened her presence, yet when she spotted me waiting on the balcony, her expression softened instantly. She set her bag down with a sigh, and as she stepped into the sunlight, it was as if the house itself welcomed her. We sat across from each other with cups of chamomile tea, the steam curling in the breeze, the ocean stretching endlessly before us. Jasmine leaned back, her shoulders relaxing, and for a long moment we simply sat in silence, listening to the waves. Then she turned her gaze toward me, her eyes steady, warm, but searching. "Claire," she said slowly, her voice carrying both admiration and gravity, "you look different. Not just successful, whole. You've built something most people only dream about." Her words settled over me with a weight that was both comforting and heavy, like a blanket laid across my chest. I traced the rim of my cup with my fingertip, grounding myself in the warmth of the porcelain. 10 years, Jasmine," I whispered, my throat tightening. 10 years since that night. You never left my side." Her lips curved into a faint smile, and she reached out her hand, closing over mine on the table. The contact was simple, but it carried the strength of all the nights she had stayed awake with me, all the mornings she had pushed me forward when I wanted to give up. "You know why," she said softly. "Family isn't always the people who share your blood. It's the ones who hold you up when you collapse. That's who I've always wanted to be for you." The words pierced through me, gentler than any blade, but deep. I looked into her eyes and saw not pity, not obligation, but choice. Jasmine had chosen me when my own family had turned away. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The breeze off the ocean carried the salt of memory, stinging and cleansing at once. "Still," I murmured, "sometimes it feels like there's a hole that success can't fill. They cut me out as if I were nothing. And no matter how far I climb, that truth lingers." Her hand tightened over mine, her gaze shifting from soft to fierce. "Then let them see." Let them see what you've become without them. The words struck deep, not as anger but as a summons. I thought of the email again, my mother's name glowing on my laptop after a decade of silence, the family list beneath it, the address of my house written there like fate's cruel signature. At first, it had felt like mockery, but here with Jasmine's hand steady on mine, I felt the irony turning into clarity. They chose exclusion, Jasmine continued, her voice as calm and firm as the waves rolling in. But destiny chose irony. They walked straight into the proof of your survival. You don't need their approval. But maybe, Claire, you need this moment, to stand in your truth without fear. Her conviction lit something inside me. For years I had buried confrontation under contracts, accolades, and glass walls. I told myself independence was enough, that silence was safer. But maybe fate had not brought them here for vengeance. Maybe it was for me, for closure. The sun dipped lower, casting the water in strokes of gold and rose. Jasmine leaned back in her chair, her eyes on mine, her faint smile more knowing than words could ever be. She didn't press further. She didn't have to. The silence between us carried more than any speech. I felt the decision root itself in me, steady and undeniable. My chest tightened, but not with fear, with resolve. Maybe I said slowly, my voice barely more than a breath, "It's time." The words lingered between us, caught in the hush of evening, and Jasmine's smile deepened. She gave my hand one last squeeze before releasing it, and we both turned our eyes back to the horizon. The waves rolled endlessly forward, and I knew so would I. Jasmine's words lingered in my head long after she left. Let them see who you are now. They carried strength, yet I knew that showing my house or my company would never quiet the hollow place left behind by rejection. That was why I found myself one foggy morning driving along Ocean View Boulevard, pulling into a small office tucked quietly between a bookstore and a florist in Pacific Grove. The brass plate by the door read, "Dr. Karen Lewis, licensed therapist." Inside, the world slowed. The room glowed with soft yellow light from shaded lamps, not the harsh brightness of offices I was used to. Sheer curtains let in muted daylight, and a faint trace of lavender lingered in the air. A clock ticked gently on the wall. The hum of the ocean outside was faint, like a heartbeat I could almost lean against. She greeted me with a steady smile. Her presence was calm but solid, as if she knew I had carried something heavy for too long. "Please come in," she said, her voice low, unhurried. I sat down in a wide chair across from her desk, sinking into the cushions. She handed me a mug of chamomile tea, its warmth filling my palms. For a while we sat in silence. Only the scratch of her pen moving lightly across a notepad broke the stillness. It wasn't a silence that demanded, but one that invited. My throat felt dry, but I began. Slowly. "I've carried things I never say out loud." My voice cracked and I gripped the mug tighter. When I was young, I thought if I worked hard enough, maybe my parents would see me. Maybe my brother would respect me. Dr. Lewis tilted her head slightly, her eyes holding mine but not pushing. The words tumbled out, halting jagged. I told her about that Thanksgiving night, about the turkey untouched on my plate, about David's voice saying I wasn't needed. My hands shook as I spoke. At one point my throat closed, and I pressed the back of my hand to my mouth, trying to hold myself together. But the silence around me was patient, steady. I pressed forward. Every success since then, every deal I closed, every award, it all had his voice behind it, whispering it still wasn't enough. My breath hitched. Sometimes I feel like no matter what I build, I'm still the girl who was told to leave the table. A tear slipped before I could stop it, sliding hot across my cheek. I looked down quickly, ashamed, but Dr. Lewis didn't move to hand me a tissue. She let me sit with it until I reached for one myself. When I finally dared to look up, she spoke, her words simple, measured. "Claire, your worth does not come from them." It was not a lecture. It was a fact laid gently but firmly between us. I shook my head, tears blurring my vision. But it feels like it does. I still hear him, my father's silence. Susan changing the subject like my words didn't exist. I. My voice broke, the rest caught in my chest. We sat like that, the only sound was the clock ticking softly. She leaned forward slightly, her voice steady. They gave you rejection. But you don't have to carry it forever. Healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means you choose not to let their voices define you anymore. I closed my eyes, clutching the tissue tight in my hand. For a moment, I could almost hear the clink of silverware from that dinner, the scraping of my chair as I stood. The memory rose sharp, then softened as her words settled. Forgiveness, she added quietly after a long pause, isn't excusing them. It's freeing yourself. You deserve to walk without their weight on your shoulders. Something in me broke open then. My chest heaved. My breath came in jagged waves. I hadn't cried in front of anyone for years, not like this, but here I let the tears come. They fell heavy, soaking the crumpled tissue, my shoulders shaking. Dr. Lewis didn't move closer. She didn't fill the air with words. She simply let the silence hold me, let me grieve the family that had never truly been mine. When the tears finally slowed, I felt wrung out but lighter. My hands were unsteady as I set the mug down, now cold. She smiled gently, not triumphant, not pitying, just present. I left her office with red eyes, the tissue balled in my fist, but each step felt less burdened. Outside, the sea breeze was sharp against my face, cutting clean through the fog in my chest. I inhaled deeply, letting the salt air burn and soothe at the same time. I knew one session would not erase decades of pain. Healing would be uneven, messy. But I had taken the first step, and the ground beneath me no longer felt as fragile. Driving home along the coast, the waves slammed against the rocks, steady and relentless. For the first time, I didn't hear, only the echo of what I had lost. I heard a call forward toward who I was becoming. Success has given me a house, a company, a life built of independence. Therapy was giving me something deeper. Permission to be whole again. Not because of what I had built, but simply because I was still here. The calm after my session with Dr. Lewis lingered not as joy, not even relief, but as a steady quiet that filled the corners where fear had once lived. Her words circled in my mind like tides against the rocks. Healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means not letting their voices define you anymore. And still, Jasmine's voice pressed close behind it. Let them see who you are now. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table, my coffee steaming in the salt-tinged air, the ocean restless beyond the glass. My phone buzzed. I glanced down almost casually, but the name on the new email stopped me cold. Mitchell family, 12 guests. The words blurred as my chest tightened. The hum of the ocean outside grew louder, pressing in like a drumbeat. It wasn't a chance. It wasn't a coincidence. My family had booked my house for Thanksgiving. The coffee in my hand turned bitter. My first instinct was sharp and immediate cancel. One call, one email, and the booking would vanish. I could shut the door before they ever stepped through it, reclaim my sanctuary, keep the silence intact. I imagined myself pressing that button, imagined the sudden relief, the house staying untouched by their laughter, their voices. Safe, but safe in the same way a locked door is safe closed, dark, suffocating. Another thought crept in, softer, tempting. Let them stay. Say nothing. Collect the money. Let them pass through the house like shadows. They would never know. I could hide behind the walls while they lived inside them, ghosts and hosts at once. The idea had its pull. Familiar. It was what I had done for years, survive by staying invisible. But the longer I sat there, the more I felt the hollowness of both choices. Canceling would keep the peace but leave me haunted. Hiding would feed the same wound that had festered for a decade. Either way, I was still letting them define me. I set the mug down with a sharp click against the wood. My reflection in the window caught my eye. The woman staring back looked different. Older. Stronger. Not the trembling girl who once ran crying into the night. Not the desperate young professional tricked by smooth promises. She was someone who had built and bled and earned her place. My pulse quickened. I whispered the words aloud, testing their strength. I won't cancel. I won't hide. The sound of my own voice steadied me. The decision rooted deep, heavy, but unshakable. If they came, they would see me. Not erased, not diminished, but undeniable. That afternoon, I moved through the house like a woman preparing for battle. I polished the hardwood floors until they gleamed, catching the afternoon light in golden streaks. I straightened the framed articles from Forbes and Architectural Digest that chronicled my rise. I placed the awards, carefully plaqued certificates, symbols of years they had not witnessed. On the shelves, I arranged photographs from galas and ribbon cuttings, faces of colleagues who had become more family to me than blood ever was. With every placement, I felt a tremor inside me ease. This was not vanity. This was testimony. Proof of the woman I had become when they decided I was nothing. Evening fell slowly, the sky bruised with streaks of violet. I stood in the center of the living room, the house glowing around me. My chest rose and fell, my hands trembling not with fear but with anticipation. It felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, the wind whipping at my back, the plunge inevitable. There was no turning away now. I picked up my phone and scrolled to Jasmine's name. My fingers hovered over the screen. For a moment I considered telling her everything, the fear, the ache, the fire churning in my chest. But in the end, I typed only 4 words. Tomorrow, they will know. When I hit send, a surge of energy raced through me, sharp as lightning. The house seemed to exhale with me, its walls alive, its silence no longer heavy but charged. Waiting. And so was I. Tomorrow they will know the truth. The words I had whispered to Jasmine the night before still thrummed inside me as dawn spread over Carmel, streaking the Pacific with ribbons of pale pink and silver. I stood behind the wide glass doors of my living room, barefoot on the cool wood floor, the house hushed but vibrating with tension. Today, the people who had cut me out of their story were about to step unknowing into mine. By mid-morning, the sound came, tires crunching slowly over gravel, the low hum of engines winding down. My heart leapt into my throat. I pressed my palm to the glass, breath fogging the surface. The first car, a black SUV, rolled to a stop. Its doors opened with heavy thuds. David stepped out. Shoulders squared, his stride purposeful, still carrying the air of someone who believed every room belonged to him. He scanned the property as if assessing his domain, unaware he was standing on mine. Emily followed, fussing with her coat, her voice bright and practical as she called to the children. Ryan bounded out first, his sneakers hitting the driveway with a slap toy car clutched in one hand. Sophie trailed close behind her, laughter sharp and pure, slicing through the salt air. Their joy was unburdened, innocent, a sound that twisted in my chest, even as it warmed something long frozen. Another car pulled in behind them, slower, heavier. My father emerged. His gait measured his once straight back, now curved under the weight of years. His hair had thinned and grayed, but the familiar silence still cloaked him like armor. Susan followed, tugging her scarf tighter, lips moving briskly as she issued instructions to an uncle struggling with luggage. One by one, doors slammed, trunks popped open, bags thudded onto the driveway. Voices overlapped, laughter rose in waves, the kind of chaotic melody that once filled Thanksgiving afternoons. From where I stood, it was deafening. The sound vibrated against the windows of my house as if testing its strength. I held myself still, spine-rigid hands trembling at my sides. They looked so certain of their place here, so casual, as though the years of silence and exile had never existed. My memories surged back, sharp as glass, the scraping of my chair against hardwood when I was cast out to the hollow night drive that followed. The contrast pressed hard against my ribs. The door handle was cold beneath my palm when I finally gripped it. I turned it slowly. The hinges groaned, the sound cutting across their chatter. I stepped out into the sunlight, the sea breeze rushing to meet me, briny and sharp, as if urging me forward. They had gathered near the porch, a loose knot of voices and movements. Emily laughed, adjusting Sophie's scarf as the little girl tugged at her sleeve. Ryan darted toward the steps, his toy car scraping noisily against the wood. David's voice boomed deep and commanding, giving directions as if he were already the host. For a fleeting second, anger flared hot and bitter, but I pressed it down. Then I saw her. Linda. She appeared from the side of the house, moving with a purposeful stride, her eyes flicking over the siding and windows as though appraising them. Then she turned, and her gaze met mine. Time collapsed. Her step faltered. The small overnight bag in her hand slipped down her arm, dangling awkwardly by the strap. Her face was drained of color. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. Shock stripped her bare of composure. For the first time in over a decade, my mother was looking directly at me. The noise around us dimmed. Laughter, footsteps, voices, all seemed to recede, muffled by the rush of blood in my ears. The children stilled Ryan clutching his toy. Sophie's smile fading as she sensed the shift in the air. I walked toward Linda, each step deliberate, each one echoing in the sudden hush. My chest was tight, breath shallow, but my resolve was iron. The weight of 10 years pressed against me, yet beneath it pulsed the strength of everything I had built, everything I had endured. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm, steady, and unshakable. "Hello, Mom." The words hung between us, simple yet heavy, more powerful than the silence that had lasted all those years. "Hello, Mom." My voice hung in the air, soft yet sharp, slicing through the chatter that had filled the room only moments earlier. My mother's face stiffened, her jaw tightening as her eyes searched mine, a flicker of disbelief betraying her composure. For an instant, the sound of the ocean outside seemed to retreat, replaced by the thick, breathless silence settling in the living room. I walked inside, each step deliberate, my heels tapping against the polished hardwood like a drumbeat. No one moved to greet me, but no one dared to stop me either. Eyes tracked my every motion, wide, uncertain, as though they were watching a ghost walk among them. My father sat rigid in the armchair near the fireplace, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the armrests. His glasses slid slightly down his nose, but he didn't lift a hand to fix them. Susan edged closer to him, her lips pinched into a thin, uneasy line. The cousins huddled together, shoulders brushing, their whispers rising and breaking apart in fragments like leaves rustling in a sudden wind. David was the first to move. His jaw clenched and he stepped forward, his eyes narrowing into suspicion. His voice broke the stillness, rough and demanding. "How did you even know we were here?" I met his stare without flinching. My lips curved into the faintest smile, one stripped of warmth, carrying only clarity. I let my gaze sweep across the room. My father, Susan, the cousins, my mother, frozen in place before returning to David. Not only did I know, I said, my voice steady. "This is my house." The words struck like a blade through glass. Gasps, rippled low voices rising in a frantic murmur. One cousin's hand flew to her mouth. Another shook his head in disbelief. The noise swelled sharp and chaotic, then collapsed into a stunned hush heavier than before. David's mouth fell open, yet no sound came. His color drained the confidence he wore like armor buckling before my eyes. His eyes darted across my face, searching for denial, for a weakness, for some crack to dismiss this truth, but there was none. My father's gaze snapped from me to David, then to Susan, confusion and something close to fear flickering in his eyes. Susan's hand rose to her scarf, twisting the fabric until her knuckles blanched. She turned away, unable to hold my gaze. My mother stood frozen by the archway, lips pressed tight, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths, as if she could not bear the weight of the silence pressing down. The room was no longer filled with their careless laughter, their bright voices. Now it held only the thrum of disbelief, the dense stillness of a family confronted with a truth too sharp to soften. I straightened my shoulders, squaring my breath, steadying. The morning light spilled through the wide windows, painting me not as an intruder, but as the rightful figure in this room. For years I had imagined this confrontation. Not for vengeance, not for the satisfaction of their shock, but for this single moment of truth. I was no longer the young woman whose chair scraped against the hardwood floor in humiliation, no longer the sister whose words were drowned in silence. I was Claire Mitchell, the woman who had rebuilt her life, who had fought for her place in the world with her own hands. And now, in the heart of my own home, surrounded by the family who once declared I did not belong, I felt the truth finally anchor itself in the air. The confrontation I had spent 10 years carrying inside me was no longer a distant imagining. It was here. It was alive, pulsing in every gaze, every held breath, every silence that stretched too long. And I was ready. This is my house. The words still vibrated in the air, and I watched as David's face flushed a deep crimson. His lips pressed together so tightly they trembled, his nostrils flaring as if every breath scorched him. For a second he stood frozen, the disbelief etched in the hard lines of his face. Then anger broke loose. His fists clenched at his sides, veins rising against his skin. He took a step forward, his shoulders squared, his voice breaking into the silence with the rawness of fury. "What are you trying to prove, Claire? You think walking in here with your smug little smile makes you better than us?" His words cracked, not steady, but trembling with rage and something far more fragile beneath it. I didn't move. I let him spit his venom, let his anger roll across the room where everyone else sat in stunned stillness. His eyes darted toward our father, toward Susan, toward the cousins, searching for someone to back him, to nod, to give him the upper hand he always assumed was his by right. But no one spoke. Their silence was louder than any word. I turned away from him calmly and crossed to the desk near the window. The sunlight poured across the polished wood, illuminating what I had laid there in preparation, the contracts, the deeds, every official seal and notarized page that bound this house to my name. I picked them up, the weight of the paper solid and cool in my hand, and stepped back toward him. "This isn't bragging," I said, my voice steady, low, deliberate. "And it isn't a lie. It is the truth." I held the papers out. David snatched them from me, his hands shaking so violently that the pages rustled. His eyes darted down, scanning, skimming his lips, moving soundlessly as if trying to catch a loophole hidden in the ink. His face drained as each line denied him that escape. His breathing grew shallow, ragged, his chest rising too fast. The only sound in the room was the faint tick of the grandfather clock in the corner, and beyond the glass, the relentless crash of the ocean. Everyone watched. No one dared to look away. "Do you remember?" My words cut into the silence, sharp but calm. 10 years ago, at that Thanksgiving table, you told me there was no place for me, that I wasn't needed." His head jerked up, eyes wide, his lips trembling as if a protest might come, but nothing did. He looked around again to the family scattered in the room, his supporters gone, their faces tight with discomfort, some pale, some refusing to meet his gaze. "And now," I said, my voice firm, "you stand in my house. A house I earned, a life I built, without you." The weight of those words landed like blows. His shoulders sagged, his jaw slackening as though the strength to hold it clenched had left him. The papers quivered in his grip, slipping until the edges bent and curled. For the first time in my life, David looked small, his pride cracked open, his posture unsteady, his authority stripped bare in front of everyone. My father shifted in his chair, his eyes dark, unreadable. Susan's hand went to her scarf, twisting the fabric, as if she could pull herself out of the moment. The cousins sat rigid, their whispers snuffed out, staring at the two of us, as though they had wandered into a storm. David's lips parted, trembling. His breath shuddered out, but no words followed. His chest rose and fell, his body rocking slightly as if the ground itself had tilted beneath him. And in that silence, something inside me loosened. For years I had carried this confrontation in my chest, bracing for an explosion, for tears, for fire. Yet now, as I looked at him, unravel, what I felt was not vengeance but release. The storm I had prepared for did not come. Instead, there was only the quiet collapse of his pride and the realization that I no longer needed him to acknowledge me, to validate me, to give me a place. The confrontation I had feared for a decade ended not with his rage or my tears, but with silence. And in that silence, I found the freedom I had been searching for all along. David's face had turned ashen, and the room hung heavy with silence. It was so thick, it felt as if even the air refused to move. My chest tightened under its weight until it cracked open with the sound of two young voices. Ryan and Sophie, his children, peered at me with wide eyes, unclouded by the bitterness swirling between the adults. Aunt Claire. Sophie asked, her voice soft, "How did you get such a big house?" Her innocence pierced through the tension. My lips softened into a smile, small but real. I lowered myself so I was eye level with them, the wood floor cool beneath my knees. "I work in real estate," I said gently. "I help people find homes. I worked very hard for many years, and that's how this house became mine." I left out the betrayals, the slammed doors, the cold silence that had shaped so much of my life. They didn't need that weight. What I wanted for them was something else, a story of resilience, of work that bore fruit, not of scars. Emily shifted behind them, her hands clasped too tightly. Her smile stretched thin. "Claire, we're all family," she murmured, her voice smooth but brittle. "Let's not dwell on the past." Her eyes flicked away quickly, betraying the hollowness behind her words. It was not warmth she offered, but politeness, fragile and shallow. Then my mother spoke. Her voice wavered as though it had rehearsed the line too often in her head. "Everyone makes mistakes, Claire. We were foolish. Please let's leave it behind." Her eyes didn't hold steady when they met mine. They flickered, darting, unable to carry the weight of what she asked. My father remained silent, his gaze pinned to the floor. Susan fidgeted with her scarf, pulling the fabric tighter at her throat. None of them stepped forward. None of them truly bridged the space between us. I rose slowly, my spine straightening, the quiet in my voice carrying more steel than any raised tone could. Mistakes have consequences. For 10 years I lived without a family. For 10 years I built my life alone. I no longer need the approval of those who turned away from me. The silence that followed was not the same as before. It was heavier, resigned, filled with the recognition that nothing they said could unmake the truth. Boundaries had been set clear and immovable. Then Ryan's small hand brushed mine, tentative but trusting. Sophie followed, slipping her fingers into my other palm. Their touch was light, but it pulled me out of the heaviness like a tide carrying me forward. "Would you like me to show you the house?" I asked softly. "There's a pool outside and a garden where the flowers bloom even in the wind." Their faces lit up, eyes bright, laughter spilling into the room like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. They tugged at my hands, urging me toward the patio doors. I let them lead, their joy filling spaces that bitterness had long hollowed out. Behind us, the living room stayed still, the adults frozen in their shame and unease. I didn't need to look back to feel it. Regret clung to them, sharp and silent. As I guided Ryan and Sophie through the home I had fought to build, I felt a clarity settle in me. I was no longer seeking a seat at their table. I was building my own one where truth and kindness could exist without compromise. The divide between me and the older generation was carved too deep to bridge. But with the children, there was hope, a chance to rewrite what family could mean. A chance to pass on not bitterness, but resilience. And perhaps that was the truest kind of revenge, not in breaking them, but in choosing to live fully, to open my hands to the future, even as I closed the door on the past. "Would you like me to show you around the house?" The children's laughter spilled into the air, clear and bright, lifting the heaviness that had clung to the day. Ryan and Sophie's hands were small and warm in mine as we walked together down the hall. I pointed out the roses swaying outside the window, the pool shimmering as if it held its own light, the balcony that opened like a promise to the horizon. They gasped, eyes shining every corner, to them a treasure. To them this place was not about triumph or revenge, it was simply beautiful. Their joy reminded me that maybe the true gift of all I had endured was this, the chance to give something softer to those who came after me. When I brought them back to Emily, her smile was tight, her eyes betraying unease. David sat hunched, the documents slack in his hands, as if they had drained the fight from him. My mother and father exchanged silent glances, their faces etched with a discomfort too deep for words. I felt no urge to fill that silence. There was nothing left to say. They were guests in my house now, and I was no longer the one pushed out into the cold. I stepped outside, steady leaving them to their Thanksgiving. For the first time, walking away did not sting, it felt like release. The evening air wrapped around me as I drove into town. The waves thundered against the cliffs, the sound no longer mocking but steady like an old companion. At a quiet restaurant by the shore, I found Jasmine. Candles flickered against the glass, and her eyes held mine as I told her everything. She listened in silence, her hand resting over mine, her touch grounding me in a way words never could. When I finished, she smiled softly and said, "I'm proud of you." Her words sank deep, not as comfort, but as truth. Jasmine had always been more than a friend. She was the anchor I had chosen, the family I had built. Sitting across from her, sharing a simple meal, I felt the bitterness finally loosen its grip. In its place was something gentler. Peace. That night back in my room, I lay beneath the hush of the ocean. The moon spilled silver across the water, and I thought of the girl I had been 10 years ago, the one who had walked out of a dining room with tears streaming down her face, believing she would never belong anywhere again. My chest ached at the memory, but only for a moment. Because now I understood. I had made my own table. Not one of forced smiles or silence that cut like knives, but one filled with authenticity, with laughter I could trust, with love I chose, and that chose me in return. The past would always be a part of me, a scar carved deep, but scars are not cages. They are proof. And that night, listening to the ocean's rhythm, I knew I had closed the chapter not with vengeance, but with dignity. Family teaches us how to show up in the world, but it is up to us to decide which lessons to keep and which to leave behind. We get to choose how we define family. My beach house remains my sanctuary, but it is no longer a place of hiding or isolation. It is simply home, a reflection of the woman I have become. Sometimes it is filled with chosen family laughter spilling out during dinners and celebrations. Sometimes it welcomes hesitant visits from relatives testing the boundaries of belonging. But like the house itself, I remain steady against the waves, not defiant, not yielding, simply present. And now I want to ask you, have you ever had to set boundaries with family members who did not treat you with the respect you deserved? What gave you the strength to stand your ground? Share your story in the comments below. If this story resonates with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who may need the reminder that their worth is not defined by their family's approval. Thank you for walking with me through this journey of healing and self-discovery. And remember, sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is claim space in our own